A 10-year-old sapper, from the French of F. Soulié. This is recorded to celebrate the 10th anniversary of LibriVox. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A 10-year-old sapper. A tale for young people. In 1812 there was in the 9th Regiment of the Line a little drummer who was only 10 years old. He was the child of the regiment, whose real name was Frulou, but to whom the soldiers had given the nickname of Bilboquet. To those English readers who do not know the meaning of the word bilboquet, I may explain that it is the French name of the game known to us as cup and ball. The application of the word to the little drummer, Frulou, was easy to understand. His body was so long, so thin and slight, surmounted as it was by a very large head, that he really looked not unlike the plaything whose name was given him by the soldiers. Except for this grotesque resemblance to a cup and ball, his appearance was in no way remarkable. The drum major had taken a dislike to him, and far more frequently than was necessary he was in the habit of beating the tattoo upon the boy's shoulders with his long cane, in order, as he said, to give him a practical idea of his trade. Everybody laughed at poor Bilboquet. His comrades played no end of tricks upon him. They kicked him about without ceremony, and called him a knock-kneed skulk, on account of his thin and ill-formed legs, and whenever he showed an inclination to complain they dubbed him the Sniveller. One day, the 12th of July, 1812, the general who commanded the brigade to which the regiment of Bilboquet belonged, received from the Emperor the order to seize upon a position which was on the other side of an enormous ravine. This ravine was defended by a battery which mowed down entire ranks of soldiers, and, in order to reach the place which the Emperor had designated, it was absolutely necessary to silence this terrible battery. At this moment the regiment of Bilboquet was on the bank of the Dwina, for the story I am relating to you took place during the campaign in Russia. Suddenly there arrived at the top of his speed an aide de camp, bringing the order to 2 companies of the voltigeurs to charge the battery. It was a bold and difficult operation, and to effect it, it was foreseen that more than 3/4 of the men engaged in the enterprise would be killed or wounded. Thus the voltigeurs, in spite of their bravery, looked at each other, shaking their heads and shrugging their shoulders. "Soldiers," cried the aide de camp, "it is the order of the Emperor," and he galloped away. "Why didn't you say so before, greenhorn?" growled an old sergeant, fixing his bayonet at the end of his gun. "Well, well, I suppose we mustn't keep the Little Corporal waiting." [Footnote: The Little Corporal was the nickname given to Napoleon I by his soldiers.] "When he tells you to go and get killed, he doesn't like any answering back." Still, there remained some hesitation among the troops of the company, and already the captain had twice given the order to the drum major to take 2 drummers and advance in beating the charge. But the drum major remained leaned upon his long cane, shaking his head and very little disposed to obey. During this time Bilboquet, seated aside of his drum, and his eyes fixed upon his chief, whistled a lively air and beat the charge with his fingers on the side of his drum. For the 3rd time the order to advance was given to the drum major, who showed no disposition to obey, when, all at once, little Bilboquet rose, hung his drum at his side, seized his drumsticks, and, passing before the drum major, looked him up and down with scorn, returning in a single sentence all the abuse which his superior had so often inflicted upon him. "Why don't you come along, you big skulk?" The drum major lifted his cane, but already Bilboquet was at the head of the 2 companies, beating the charge with enthusiasm. At the sight of this the soldiers rushed after him and ran towards the terrible battery. In another instant a broadside of fire burst from the enemy's cannon, and entire ranks of the brave voltigeurs fell, never to rise again. The smoke driven by the wind enshrouded them. The noise of the cannon stunned for a moment the brave fellows who were unhurt, but as the smoke finally lifted and the noise ceased for an instant, they saw proudly standing 20 paces in front of them the intrepid Bilboquet still vigorously beating the charge. It was enough for them to hear his drum, whose beat seemed to taunt all the big cannon levelled against the advance of the little troop. Forward, still forward, ran the voltigeurs, and still in front of them could be heard the tattoo of the drum calling upon them to follow. Then there was a second volley from the battery, and a whirlwind of grape shot again mowed down the two heroic companies. At this moment Bilboquet turned round and saw that there remained scarcely more than 50 of his comrades out of the 200 who had commenced the charge. Instantly, as if transported by the fury of vengeance, he commenced beating his drum louder than ever. One might have imagined 20 drums all rattling together, and certainly the drum major himself had never so boldly beaten a drum. With a final hurrah, the soldiers rushed forward like an avalanche, and entered the battery, Bilboquet, the very first, shouting to the Russians, "The bits of us left are all right. Here they are, so look out for yourselves." During all this time Napoleon was on a hillock surveying the performance of this heroic exploit. At every discharge of the battery he started with excitement upon his white horse. Then, when the soldiers at last carried the battery, he lowered his field glass, muttering to himself, "My brave boys." Immediately afterwards, by order of Napoleon, an aide de camp rode to the battery and returned at the top of his speed. "How many of them have reached it?" asked the Emperor. 40, replied the aide de camp. "There shall be 40 crosses of the Legion of Honor for them tomorrow," said the Emperor, as he returned to his headquarters. The next day the entire regiment formed a circle around the remnant of the two companies. The names of the 40 brave men who had taken the battery were called in succession, and to each was given the coveted Cross of the Legion of Honor. The ceremony was finished, when a childish voice from the ranks exclaimed, with a singular accent of surprise, "How about me? Don't I get anything?" The general who distributed the crosses turned round and saw standing before him our little comrade, Bilboquet. His cheeks reddened and his eyes filled with tears. "You?" said the general. "What do you want?" "Why, General," said Bilboquet, in a tone of repressed anger, "I was one of them. I went forward and beat the charge, and I was the first to enter the battery." "Never mind, my lad," replied the general. "It seems you've been forgotten. Moreover," he added, "you are still very young, but you shall have the cross when you get a beard on your chin. In the meantime, here is something to console you." With these words the general offered him a 20-franc piece, which Bilboquet looked at without attempting to take it. There was a dead silence around him, and everyone looked at him attentively. He remained motionless before the general, and great tears rolled down his cheeks. Those of his comrades who had most turned him into ridicule were softened, and perhaps they would have clamored that the cross should be given to him, when all at once he raised his head as if he had just taken a great resolution, and said, "All right, General. Give me the 20 francs. The cross will do next time." And without further ceremony he put the money in his pocket, and returned to the ranks, whistling with a deliberate and satisfied air. Some time after this the French troops entered Smolensk, victorious and full of ardor. Bilboquet was among them, and on the very day they entered the town, strolling about the place, he saw a little shop kept by a man with a magnificent beard. The merchant approached the drummer and asked him humbly, in bad French, "What is it I can sell you, my little gentleman?" "I want your beard," said Bilboquet, bluntly. "My beard?" said the stupefied merchant. "You must be joking." "I tell you I want your beard," replied Bilboquet, proudly placing his hand on the hilt of his sabre. "But don't imagine that I want to steal it. Here is a Napoleon in payment. I suppose you don't want more than that for it?" The poor man tried to argue the question with the little drummer, but he was as obstinate as a blind horse, and presently the two were engaged in such a hot dispute that the attention of some passing soldiers was attracted. They gathered round to learn the cause of the quarrel, and the idea of the drummer boy seemed to them so droll that they compelled the Russian shopkeeper to give up his beard. One of them, a Gascon, and a barber of the regiment, brought forth a razor from his pocket, and commenced shaving the poor merchant, without either water or soap, and after scraping him for some time, finally got off his beard, which he gave to Bilboquet, who carried it off triumphantly. On returning to quarters, he had his trophy sewn by the tailor to a bit of ass's skin from the top of a broken drum, and put it in the bottom of his kit. The soldiers joked about it for several days, but it was not long before they had more serious matters to think about. The march of the army was resumed, and no one thought more about little Bilboquet and his beard when Napoleon arrived at Moscow. Then terrible misfortunes took place. The intense cold and the devastation of the country deprived the French army of every resource. It suffered from famine, and soon was obliged to retreat through a country deserted and covered many feet deep with snow. Each man dragged himself along as best he could, and there remained very few regiments in sufficient order to obey their generals. In some, however, order was still maintained, and the regiment of Bilboquet was one of these. It formed part of the rear guard, which prevented the Cossacks from butchering the miserable stragglers of the army. One day they succeeded in crossing a small river, and, in order to retard the pursuit of the enemy, they had attempted to blow up 2 arches of the wooden bridge they had just crossed. But the barrels of powder were so hastily placed that the explosion produced little effect. The arches, however, were shattered, but the framework of the bridge was still upheld by a stout beam which, should the enemy arrive, would have enabled them to partially reconstruct the bridge. The general in command, perceiving that the safety of the army absolutely depended upon the total destruction of the bridge, gave orders to some sappers to cut down the beam and thus destroy the remains of the framework. But at the moment when they were about to undertake the work the enemy arrived on the other side of the river and commenced a fire so terrible that it seemed unlikely that any of the sappers would be able to reach the fatal beam alive. In fact, they were about to retreat, defending themselves as well as they could, when all at once a soldier was seen to throw himself into the river with an axe on his shoulder. At first he plunged under the water, but soon he reappeared above the surface. By his beard it was seen that he was a sapper who was risking his life for the safety of his comrades and the army. The entire regiment attentively followed him with their eyes, and saw him swim towards the bridge, whilst a hail of bullets struck the water all around him. But the brave sapper still continued to swim vigorously. At last, after unheard of efforts, he reached the bridge, mounted upon the arch, and with a few strokes of his axe cut through the remains of the beam, which at a distance seemed enormous, but which in reality had been fortunately partly destroyed by the explosion. Immediately afterwards the entire woodwork of the bridge fell with a great splash into the river, and the brave sapper could no longer be seen. But all at once his comrades spied him amongst the floating fragments swimming towards the bank. The soldiers sprang forward, filled with joy and admiration. Hundreds of hands were stretched out to the swimmer by way of encouragement. The general himself approached the banks of the river, and was greatly astonished to see Bilboquet come out of the water with an immense black beard hanging from his chin. "What's all this?" he cried, "and what is the meaning of this beard?" "Oh, General," replied the drummer, "it is only Bilboquet to whom you said that he should have the cross of honour when he got a beard on his chin. This is a famous one, I think you'll admit. You see, General, I have done my best to obtain full value for the money, and, in fact, I spent the whole 20 francs you gave me to decorate my chin." The general, surprised at so much courage allied with wit and cunning, took Bilboquet by the hand as if he had been a man, and gave him on the spot the cross of the Legion of Honour, which the general himself wore on his breast. And from that moment the old soldiers of the regiment saluted Bilboquet with friendship, and the drum major never again beat the tattoo on the boy's shoulders. End of A 10-Year-Old Sapper by F. Soulié. Read for LibriVox by Marianne Spiegel.